Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the fourth and final event of our series exploring life cycle rituals from the perspective of 6 different faiths. My name is Benjamin Rifkin, and I am a professor of Russian at Hofstra University and a member of the board of directors of the Interfaith Institute of Long Island. I am your host for tonight's event, which is co-sponsored both by the Interfaith Institute of Long Island and Hofstra University. This is the final of the 4 events in our series, Exploring Life Cycle Rituals. The first event was held in November 2021 on the topic of welcoming a child into the family and into the faith tradition. The second event in the series, held in December 2021, was on the topic of rituals marking the entrance into adulthood. The third, and may I say most joyous event of the series, was held in January 2022 on the topic of weddings. You can find recordings of all of these discussions on the web at interfaithnewyork.com under the rubric of videos, as well as on the YouTube channel of the Interfaith Institute of Long Island. Tonight, we will have a very thoughtful panel discussion focusing on the ways adherents of 6 different faith traditions mark the passage from life to death. Tonight's topic is traditions surrounding the process of dying, death itself, and funerals in the following religious faiths, which I am listing in alphabetical order of the name of the religion: Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Jainism, Judaism, and Sikhism. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd like to make a comment that it is difficult for us to turn our thoughts and focus them without acknowledging significant events unfolding halfway around the world from us right now. As I mentioned in my introduction tonight, I'm a professor of Russian, and I have spent considerable amount of time in Ukraine, have many friends who are, and colleagues who are Ukrainian, on both sides of the border between Russia and Ukraine. And I would like for us to just take a moment of silence for each of us and for those listening and watching later, to share a prayer or an aspiration of hope in whatever way is your tradition, for peace in the region, that the people of Ukraine and Russia will move away from weapons and come together in a spirit of peace and friendship that the world so desperately needs. So to that end, I ask now for a moment of silence. Thank you. Dziękuję. Spasiba. And then one more thing before we begin tonight. One of our speakers this evening is the chairman of the board of the Interfaith Institute of Long Island, Dr. Farooq Khan, and he is also one of the founding members of the Interfaith Institute. And I'd like to ask Dr. Khan to share welcoming remarks. Dr. Khan?
Thank you, Ben. It's indeed a pleasure and a great delight to be here with all of you. And I particularly want to thank Ben. He conceived of this series of programs way back a couple of months ago, got together all the panelists, and we've had a very, very informative conversation among the different folks and panelists. So Ben, I don't know what we're going to do without you next month. And thanks for all the effort you have put in. And thank you for all the panelists and all the attendees here, who this is probably going to be the largest get together for this series of events. And Ben, you mentioned about marriage. It's interesting. Death brought in more people than marriage. So take it for whatever it is. So with that, I turn it over to you and we'll move on with the program.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Khan. We're going to proceed now to this evening's event. And I just, for those of you who have not joined us for any of the previous events in the series, I want to just give you a word about the structure of the evening. So we'll have presentations by 6 different individuals about the issues of death and dying. Then after the 6 presentations, then I will open up for discussion among the presenters. So they will share remarks and make comments. I might ask a question of everyone. And then lastly, then before time is out, we'll have 15 or so minutes for questions from the attendees. And I'll give instructions about how we'll take those questions at that time. At this point, I'd like to ask that everybody mute themselves, and I will mute myself after I introduce our speaker. Our first speaker tonight, again, in the order of the alphabetical order of the names of the religious traditions. Our first speaker tonight is Monsignor Donald Beckman, a member of the Board of Directors of the Interfaith Institute of Long Island and the Director Emeritus of the Diocesan Ecumenical and Interfaith Office. Monsignor Beckman will discuss this evening's topics from the perspective of Christianity. Father Beckman, I see you're unmuted and ready to go.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you for your words of introduction and your prayer during this very tragic time for Ukraine and for our world. I have to admit that I found myself facing a certain challenge in trying to speak about Christian practices of death and dying, while generally speaking, all Christians of whatever denomination have the same belief about the meaning of death and dying and life after death. Our practices from one another are very divergent. Part of this is a question of ethnicity. Part of it is a question of theology. All of you will remember from your history that debate over prayers for the deceased, the indulgence question, actually became the leading issue of the Reformation that has left us divided as Christians for 500 years. So, well, I'll be able to say a bit about practices that needs to be said in light of the meaning that we do share. Now, in sharing that, in sharing our faith in the meaning of life, death, and life after death, I want to be very clear that I'm not trying to convert anyone. I'm not trying to say that what I believe is better than what other faith traditions teach. But I simply, as I say, need to do that in order to give a context to the very diverse way in which we as Christians tend to react and practice issues of death and dying. So let me begin with the sense of the meaning. For us, all life, spiritual and physical, all creation is a gift of God's love. The book of Genesis tells us that God looked upon what God created and found it very good. Death, we understand, entered into creation because of human evil and sin. To restore the goodness of creation and to rescue human beings from death, God decided to share fully in our human experience. Jesus of Nazareth, who we understand to be both divine and human, took on himself all the evil, all the violence, all the hatred, all the warfare, all the sin of the world, bore it to death on the cross, and restored life by his rising from the dead. Every human being still faces the evil of death, but we believe that in Christ we can face it in hope of eternal life. And as our Apostles' Creed teaches, we look forward to the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting in what the book of Revelation calls a new heavens and a new earth. So all Christians seek to open our hearts to that faith that assures us of victory over death. But we do have different ways of practicing that faith. Those of us, such as myself as a Roman Catholic, from churches with a deep sacramental tradition, make use of several sacraments in the face of death. The biblical letter of St. James speaks of what we now call the sacrament of the sick, an anointing with blessed oil. This is a prayer for healing, for rescuing from death, but some traditions also use it as a preparation for death, if God wills not to offer the healing, but to welcome the person into death. That sacramental tradition also offers the Eucharist to the dying person as viaticum, literally with you along the way. The dying person receives the body and blood of Christ in communion to accompany him or her on the journey to new life. And again, within the sacramental tradition, the Eucharist is often celebrated as the funeral service. But all Christians pray for those who have dying, that they may have the faith to accept God's offer of eternal life. We also pray for the courage to forgive others, for this is the one condition that Jesus taught as necessary to receive God's forgiveness. Most Christians will have a wake service. Traditionally, that would go for 3 days, remembering Jesus' 3 days in the tomb. Modern economic issues generally have reduced that to 1 day, 1 evening. But it's an opportunity for people to gather, to pray, to support the loved ones of the deceased. And after the funeral, again, there is often a gathering, most of the times over food. People share stories. People share loving memories about the deceased. In my own Irish tradition, this is always accompanied by humor. You thought I was going to say this is always accompanied by alcohol, but it's always accompanied by laughing memory of the good things about the person. We look for ways to support the bereaved as they face a shared future. Going back to what I said at the beginning, whether or not we actually pray for those who have died, that's still a divisive issue among us, and that's more than we have time to deal with this evening.
Onto the very large from the right direction and a very large breakout of our support.
Thank you, Father Beckman. I want to make sure that everybody else is muted right now. There's sound coming from someone. I can't find it. Okay, so again, thank you, Father Beckman. And next we have Dr. Badra Shah, who will be speaking about Hinduism. Dr. Shah is also a member of the board of directors of the Interfaith Institute of Long Island. Dr. Shah, I see you've unmuted yourself, and I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben, especially for giving me the opportunity to participate in this program, and also for the special prayer, which is very, very needed and is timely. So thank you very much. Now, going to our subject, death and dying, Hinduism perspective, I will say a few words as I understand. It may differ from the opinions of experts and religious leaders or scholars, but what I understand, I'm going to present. Now here, first to understand death and dying, we need to understand what is the life cycle. Now, starting from the womb, then the baby is born, then gradually it goes, we grow, and then there is a steady, and then this is dying and this is death. And something happens, something comes in which energizes, or that light gives all levels something, and that goes away when we die. Okay, so my understanding is that this is all we finished. Today we are just going to talk about dying and death. This is dying and this is death. So first of all, I would like to know, what is death? Legally, we can say it is a natural death, accidental, suicidal, homicidal, undetermined, etc. We are not really interested right now. Medically, we say clinical death, brain death, molecular death, emotional death, physical death, etc., which is also not a subject for us to discuss today. Now, common people, we say he or she passed away, or he or she no more. What is it? Because in this dead body, the body is still there in our front of our eyes, but we say he passed away somewhere, or he is no more. What is that? This light, which is still there when the person is dying, it goes away in infinite. That is where we call that he or she passed away. Religiously, we say return home, and spiritually, it is just the change of form, because in this life cycle, as I showed before, whatever that yellow light goes away, goes into the infinite, and the same light chooses again to ignite some sperm to fertilize the ovum, and that fertilized ovum grows back. So this light does the same thing again. So in Hinduism, it is just a life cycle. Now, right, what is death? We understood now that it differs in a different way when we talk about. Now, what is that which enters at the time of conception, responsible for growth, maturity, sustenance, decay, and goes away at the time of death? We call it by different names. It could be soul, Atman, spirit, light, self, consciousness, fire, energy, life. That's what it is. Now, what happens when we are growing? The same, that light makes us grow physically, emotionally, mentally, intellectually, and spiritually. Up to this time, we're growing in each way. Then what happens? Maturity and sustenance, physical maturity, we are not growing anymore, but it is sustained. And emotionally, mentally, intellectually, and spiritually, we are still growing in this stage too. Then what happens? When we grow older, the physical decay, we start getting problems in our body, that decay starts. Emotionally, we are stable. Mental and intellectually, it starts getting fuzzy. We start forgetting. We are not interested in many things. That's what happens when the decay starts. But spiritually, we continue to grow. Then dying, that is a preparation for death or to exit. It's an extreme physical decay. This body, the physical body, is so much decayed, it's not able to even move on its own. But emotional, mental, and intellectually, there is a detachment. This is the time when the person gets detached from everything, and spiritually peaceful and looking forward to merge in that light. And when death occurs, see, that light is already going away in infinite. D is detached, is end of physical body, end of suffering is death. A is all pervading and peaceful. That real self is very all-pervading and peaceful. He is true surrender. At that time, we truly surrendered to Almighty. And H is harmless. This body is not going to get up and do any harm to anyone. Then, uh, rituals. Now, the real subject is our rituals and community. So, in Hinduism, there are different kinds of rituals at the different time. Now, when the person is dying, that time we preferably bring them home with a family and loved ones. Imminent death, when the death is real imminent, then we place them on with the grass mat, positioned at entrance of the door, home, or in their room with their head towards east. Place small amount of Ganges water in person's mouth. That is very auspicious. Family sings hymns, recites prayers, and chant mantras. This is to create a very happy, peaceful, and joyful atmosphere for that spirit to leave the attachment with this body. Then ritual is the time of death. The, that spirit is gone. So body is placed with the head towards south and big toes and thumbs are tied together. Several rituals done with several variations, and body is redressed and flowers offered. Some rice are placed in mouth with a silver coin. Wife may place her Mangal Sutra on his neck. Body is placed on the kapil or tied to the thathadi. I will show you the thathadi soon. Body is removed from home, feet first. Then funeral. We take the body to the funeral home for viewing. Viewing is the final darshan or the glimpses of the loved ones. That is the last time you're going to see that face. And then eulogy, the short speeches or pieces of writing that praises good deeds or something highly special or typical of someone who has just died. Final farewell or final goodbye by family and friends. Then cremation ceremony. This is the top is the thathadi with the dead body. Now, in real Hinduism, this is what is more common even in India, but India also now different ways are being accepted, and outside the India, most of the places is the cremation chamber. So here, what they do is pyre is made of wood and straw. Final rituals of taking the body 3 times around the fire, counterclockwise, and then placing it on the platform. Chief mourner, most of the time is the eldest son, takes 3 circles around the fire with a clay pot full of water on his left shoulder and burning torch behind his back, and he lights the fire after the 3rd circle. Then funeral. After body is cremated, now final, no, this one was done. This is funeral. Okay. The cremation. Okay, now next is the rituals after cremation. So mourning period is about 13 days with a different rituals on different days. And there is a memorial service on 3rd, 5th, 7th, or 9th day. The rituals on the 13th day is the most important because these believe that the ritual performed on the 13th day, subtle body penetrates the atmosphere range of earth and attains further momentum, which means cutting off all ties with his family, all relationships, and by the subtle body and developing a relationship with the God. So this is 13th day ritual is very common, and after that the family member will change their clothes also. And after that, after the cremation, we gather the ashes of the remains from the cremation fire. Yes, and we will be putting it into the Ganges water. within 1 year, and I'm almost finished. Now, something to think about: who dies, physical body, subtle body, or causal body? In reality, physical body partially dies every day from day one. Few cells dies, but more growth. And death is end of the life or just the beginning of new form. And shall we mourn or rejoice after death of someone? Because as I just showed here, that the growth and uh, growth leads to the death, but the death will lead back to the new life. So that is what I understand from Hinduism. And this cycle goes on and on depending on our karmas. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. I hope I didn't go over.
Yes, you do.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. That was wonderful and fascinating. Our next religious tradition is Islam. And speaking about Islam is one of the founders of the Interfaith Institute of Long Island, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Farooq Khan, who also brings not only his religious experience, but just as Dr. Shah did, also his medical experience to our conversation. Dr. Khan is an intensivist, as well as the chair of the Interfaith Institute of Long Island. Dr. Khan?
Thank you, Ben. When I hear someone has passed away, I recite the following Arabic verse: Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. It is in the Quran, so it's a commandment for me, and it's used by Muslims when someone passes away. What does it mean? Verily we belong to God, Allah, and verily to Him do we return. This phrase expresses a sign of patience and an acknowledgement that God is the Almighty and He will not test His worshippers more than they can bear. For Muslim, death is a transitional event from the earthly temporary life to the superior eternal life, the hereafter. Muslims are encouraged to constantly prepare themselves by deeds and actions for the hereafter. Allow me to explain a couple of incidents from my personal and professional life, which will highlight some of the issues dealing with death. My first experience with death was in 1963, when I was called at my home in Kashmir to check on grandma, who did not look good. As a medical student with rudimentary clinical skills, I listened for grandma's heart sounds, heard none, there was no pulse, and I put a strip of cotton under grandma's nostril, and seeing no movement, I declared her dead. That was my first personal experience. And in medical terms, we would say grandma had suffered a cardiopulmonary death at home. Grandma's body was washed by female relatives. Body was covered with white cloth, placed in a casket, and after a funeral prayer, which we call janaza, she was buried in the family graveyard. Family and friends visited and offered condolences, and usually after the burial of the body, on days 4 and later on other days, the bereaved family invites friends and family, and Quranic recitations and supplications are conducted. So that basically is the ritual for an Islamic burial. And I could stop right here, but I won't. After graduation, coming to the United States, I specialized in critical care medicine and qualified as a specialist, and witnessed and contributed to the rapid advances in technology and medical care, which has created its own challenges and opportunities, both at the beginning and end of life. Questions regarding permissibility of some treatments from religious perspective are being asked on a regular basis. Although I didn't look for it, I was thrust into it because no one seemed to come up to the plate and answer these questions. Is surrogacy permitted in Islam? Is transplantation permitted in Islam? What about life support at the end of life? And as an intensivist running a very busy critical care unit in New York, it was very obvious to me that the vast majority of my patients had concerns related to their religious beliefs particularly as I embarked on a career in critical care, which necessitated dealing with many end-of-life questions. Which brings me to my second experience, impactful experience, I might say, with a critically ill patient and his family. The patient's wife took me aside and asked, "Doc, you know and I know my husband is not going to survive. Why don't you remove all these tubes and machines and let him die in peace? You will also help me and my family from financial ruin after his death." And this was in early 70s when I was managing a busy ICU in Queens, New York. This was a wake-up call for me and sensitized me to the question of finances involved in delivery of expensive end-of-life care. Such questions forced me to study and seek answers. What does my faith, Islam, teach me about death? When does death occur? How do we handle end-of-life issues? I published my research and pretty soon was being invited to speak about these issues at both national and international meetings. While it was relatively simple to pronounce grandma's death in 1963, I wasn't too sure in late 80s and 90s about the time of death in the critically ill patients under my care, who are unresponsive and getting advanced care with ventilators, pressors, and whatnot. The Quran as a guidance tells me that a person dies when God takes the soul at the time of death. So the patient lying in front of me, where is the soul? I can't see it. How do I decide the soul has left and allow nature to take its course? These were very probing questions. And the question was, is the soul in the heart when it stops so the person dies? But then we do cardiopulmonary bypasses all the time and then stop the heart. Is the soul in the lungs and breathing stops? And or is it somewhere else? Is it in the brain? Remember now, this is late 70s. Brain death was not being uniformly recognized. So I did a little digging. And while the broad guidelines were there, God decides when you leave, God takes the soul away, but he doesn't give us a time frame. It doesn't give us a timetable when, where, at what time. So I had to do my own digging, and I concluded that brain death, cortical and midbrain, is an acceptable definition of death. This view is now accepted by the majority of Islamic scholars and Islamic organizations, but not by all, I must say that. So that was my second patient. The third patient encounter will make this clear. Having established some credibility in this area, I was asked to consult on a Muslim female in her 70s who had suffered a stroke and was unresponsive for over a week in an intensive care unit in New Jersey. I had to cross the Hudson to get to see her. She had no advance directive, and her 6 adult children requested my opinion. Mom has been out for a whole week. Is she here or is she there? After clinical evaluation, it was clear that the patient was brain dead, and further care, in my opinion, was futile. Some of her children were skeptical of my recommendation. After all, her bedside cardiac monitor showed a heartbeat, and the urine bag was full of urine. So how could she possibly be dead, they asked. There was no advance directive. The 6 siblings couldn't agree. And as a result, this lady was kept in the unit for another week or so, and then had a cardiac arrest and died. These are day-to-day issues which come up in every critical care unit in now globally, basically. Based on my understanding and research, Muslims are encouraged to plan for the hereafter on a regular basis, and preparing for death becomes a central and key element in this. So here are a few take-home points. I think all of us would agree on the panel, the attendees, the moderator, the panelists. We eventually have to leave. We eventually will die. So the question is, irrespective of the background, the faith or no faith, ethnicity, everyone will encounter death. And for those of us who bury the dead, have you made plans and purchased a grave plot for yourself and your family? Just a side incident, my dad visited us in the early 80s for a visit to his grandchildren and us. And the first thing he asked, show me the cemetery where you'll bury me if I die here. That was his first question. So we took him to Washington Cemetery. I showed him that we had a plot, a reserve, and he felt more comfortable. Have all of us made the plan, purchase a grave plot for yourself and your family? Have you executed a will? Do you have advance directives, a health proxy about do not resuscitate orders, do not intubate orders? Have you made your wishes clear and everybody understands them? Very important, it makes transition at the time of death in the atmosphere we are in advanced medical care with critical care, it makes life easy for the deceased, the family, the caregivers as well. My last case presentation deals with Terry Shivo, a young woman who was in a persistent vegetative stage for 15 years. The editorial I wrote about her care is available. I can send it to whoever asks for it, or I don't know if Ben had a chance to put it in the chat box.
I did.
Okay, wonderful. So you can download it. This patient was neither here nor there. She was in a persistent vegetative state at the age of 29. And she was around for 15 years. And this led to tremendous strife within the family, her husband and her parents, the community, the law, the legislators got involved with it. And eventually, 15 years later, the judge finally said enough is enough, stopped the feedings, and she passed away 2 weeks later. So that's the persistent vegetative state, which is not brain death. She wasn't dead legally. It's a state where many patients exist. So how do we manage them? That might be a case for another day. So in summary, I've kind of shared my synopsis of the issues facing not just Muslims, but all patients in critical care at the end of life. And we all need to understand that and make proper preparations so these burdens become less. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. Very helpful and a good reminder for all of us. The next religious tradition that we will be considering is Jainism, and our next panelist is Dr. Nalini Juthani, a psychiatrist and a practitioner of Jainism. Dr. Juthani, can you please unmute yourself? And I will mute myself.
Thank you, Ben. And once again, I join in the prayer for our people all over the world as we witness the horrific war that is going on in Ukraine, and may our prayers be heard. So my topic, as you said, is death and dying according to the way I understand based on Jainism. People look at death all over the world through the lens of religion, personal belief system, and their cultural understanding. To understand the Jain view of death, you will find that there are many similarities between what Dr. Shah described from Hinduism and Jainism, but I will take a little different curve to that. To understand the Jain view of death, we should understand a bit more about 5 concepts. 1 is body, 2 is soul or Atma, 3, reincarnation, 4, karma, as most of us talk about karma as actions or our deeds, but Jainism also takes it into thoughts as well as words. 5th one is nirvana or moksha. So as I was growing up as a teenager, like most of us, I had many questions about my religion. And I was told something that I could understand and not question anymore. Body is the container. As my parents said, consider that as a container. The soul and the Atma is something that fits into the container. And so I needed to know what is that fits into a container. And I was told that soul is made of energy and does not have a physical form. It can fit itself into any body, no matter how large or small it is. It's eternal, forever cycling through death and life until enlightenment is achieved. Soul can achieve purity and enlightenment when the cycle of life and death ends and it reaches a state of bliss, which is called nirvana. So having understood this, I'll take this a little further. Body, however, takes birth and dies. Soul does not. So body can be destroyed, but soul does not get destroyed. It is immortal. Karma, the soul drives the body to act or to do karma. Therefore, soul is ultimately responsible for all of its karma. It is like, as you sow, so shall you reap. Acts of goodness takes the soul to a higher form in the universe, and negative karma takes the soul to lower forms of life. Jains believe that souls can manifest as beings as in the earth, water, or air. These souls evolve based on their level of good or bad deeds. It can be in microorganisms, plants, worms, insects, birds, reptiles, or mammals. In other words, anything that has life. That is why Jains believe in ahimsa or non-violence. Nirvana, human form, is the highest form of mammals, from where everlasting liberation from cycles of life and death is achieved. This state of bliss is called nirvana. People who have reached this state are called tirthankaras, and we worship tirthankaras, and I'll come to that in a minute. Nirvana can only be achieved when the soul is embodied in human form only. Jains do not believe in a creator or God or an external controller. All experiences, good or bad, are due to one's own karma from the past as well as from the present. The key to reach higher state of being occurs when a person vows to live a life of ahimsa, which is non-violence, truthfulness, detaching from possessions and needs, which can be material or through attachments, that is called aparigraha. The last attachment to give up in life is food and water. When a person gives up food and water and takes up fasting until death, is called santhara or salekana. Death. The Jains have a fairly death positive outlook and believe that death itself is to be part of rebirth cycle on the way to achieving enlightenment. In Jainism, death is not seen as a final moment. Instead, death is linked to birth and the cycle of reincarnation. Death is merely the soul's way of continuing the rebirth cycle. The form that soul takes for its next cycle depends on its accumulated karma. A person's inner preparation for death. For Jains, death is preceded by the rituals of dying, whereby the body prepares the soul for its next embodiment. An ideal Jain embraces death rather than fear it. Ideal Jain's view is to obtain as much inner peace during the last few days, hours, or even moments as possible so they can die peacefully. The highest desirable mode of death is known as salekana or santhara. In other words, it is to welcome death and to spend the last moments with feelings of self-actualization and spiritual liberation. This is possible by souls that are closer to liberation. It is not possible for every soul. Liberated souls called Tirthankaras or Siddhas are forever free from the reincarnation cycle. These souls no longer have physical bodies, nor will they embody a form ever again. Through enlightenment and liberation, they have obtained infinite knowledge, infinite power, infinite vision, and infinite bliss. This is called Keval Gnan. That's the highest level of knowledge. It's every Jain's ultimate goal. So do we worship or not? Jains worship these liberated souls, which are God-like, but they are not gods. They have reached nirvana and broken through the cycle of life and death. When Jains worship liberated souls, they do so to focus on an example of perfection of the soul. Jains worship these beings as inspiration for their own journey. Jains also believe that it's not like mathematics, that the karma does positive or negative deeds. And you make the subtraction, and that's where you take the reincarnation form. Confession of negative karma or sins in Jainism is called Kshamapana. Sins are mistakes we make due to ignorance. It could be in thoughts, words, or deeds. So we should not be harming or even hurting other lives, whether it is intentionally or unintentionally. An ideal Jain recites Kshamapana prayer every night. Every prayer is written in Sanskrit and translated in many languages, including English. At every funeral, we are reminded to clean our hearts and souls, so it renews our confidence in the power of forgiveness to elevate our souls and go closer to nirvana. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the ritual of the dead body. Jains cremate the body.
Jutani,
Yes.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up because we're over time now on this. So
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. You want me to stop or wrap up?
If you have something brief that you can add,
Okay.
Otherwise, if you could conclude.
Okay. So the body is, Jains do not believe in any kind of rituals. However, Jains cremate the body. We do not bury the body. And when we cremate the body is covered with ghee, incense, sandalwood, rice, coconut. And that's the only ritual we do. But after cremation, the ashes are collected, and those ashes are not dumped into the sea or the river, but they are planted in the soil or the earth, meaning that we came from the earth, and that's where we go back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Juthani. Just fascinating. And as we've noticed before in the discussions of some of the religious traditions that are indigenous to India, and as I think we'll see later, the connection of some of the words and terms that come from, I guess, Hinduism as the oldest faith of the region is fascinating and powerful. Our next religious tradition is Judaism, and speaking about Judaism is my own rabbi, Rabbi Lee Friedlander of the Reconstructionist Synagogue of the North Shore. Rabbi Friedlander, can you unmute yourself?
I have, I think.
Oh, yes, you have.
Yeah.
I'm going to mute myself and listen.
Thanks very much, Ben. And thanks for beginning the session on death and dying by looking to life and the possibility of preserving life through peace. I very much appreciate it, as did other people. So it's interesting. Judaism has a 3,800-year-long tradition of looking at life and death. I would say the bottom line is that Judaism sees death as a natural end to life, that the body was created in such a way that it will end, that life will end. What happens at the end of life is very, very much reflected by different ages and by how Jews saw themselves contextually. So the biblical tradition, of course, is going down to Sheol. And Sheol was considered to be a place of a subterranean subsistence where the person had no contact with God, but remained in his or her own personality and lived in Sheol as long as they were remembered. Of course, we know that Judaism at a certain period, together with Christianity, develops a belief in life after death. And with that, an adjustment to some of the inequities that people had on earth, so that the righteous are rewarded and the evil are condemned. But it is not so clear, and it is not universally accepted. So Judaism is a very much this worldly religion, and although people differ widely about their lives, about what happens after death, I would say there's more of an emphasis on the rituals, which have a certain commonality throughout communities throughout the world and also throughout time. There is, interestingly, a final confessional in Judaism. It's not administered by a rabbi. Usually it is recited by the individual, himself or herself, and it ends with the recitation that the Lord, our God, the Lord is one. If the person dies in the company of others, the eyes are closed, the limbs are straightened, a window is open for the spirit to depart. So death rituals break down into two groups, one related to the body that remains and the other to the mourners. So the guiding principle about the body and death is that the body indeed is considered to be a container, a sacred container. Every effort is made to recall the personness of the body and to avoid treating the body as an object. Also, there is a great emphasis in keeping the body as whole and as intact as possible in a natural state. Burial usually takes place within 24 hours if possible, unless the person dies before the Sabbath or before a holiday, in which case burial is delayed. The body is supposed to be accompanied at all times, and sometimes by members of the family, sometimes by students, rabbinical students, and the like. And there is a tradition that psalms are recited. There is a physical preparation for the body, which includes a ceremonial washing by people who are expert in this, by a group called the Hever Kadisha, the Sacred Fellowship. The body is washed according to formula. The members of the society, after the body is washed, actually address the body to ask forgiveness for any indignity that might have been caused by their washing. The body is then wrapped in shrouds. and then the body is placed in a coffin. The body is never viewed after death. That's an exceptional practice. Bodies are never embalmed unless it is so legislated by civil authorities. The body is supposed to remain in as a natural state as possible. The receptacle for the body, the coffin, is to be made simply of a basic wood, usually pine. The tradition mandates that the coffin not be fitted with any material that cannot be dissolvable, so that a so-called kosher casket is pegged and not nailed. Again, the simplicity that guides all of this is the principle is simplicity. In certain places, such as in the land of Israel, holes are actually drawn in the bottom of the coffin in order to allow the body to naturally disintegrate even more quickly. Funerals are quite simple in the Jewish tradition. Sometimes the funeral begins with some sort of ceremonial in a funeral chapel or in the synagogue, but often it takes place just at the grave. The ceremony begins with the tearing of a piece of fabric, either a ribbon or a garment, by the mourners, with a blessing, and the blessing ends with the words Dayan ha'emet, that God is a faithful judge. Flowers and music other than religious chanting is not common in Jewish funerals. There's very little liturgy for Jewish funerals. The officiant may begin with a recitation of a psalm or something from the wisdom tradition, followed by a eulogy. The rabbis say that an unworthy person should have a very long liturgy, and a person who lived a good and a connected life should have a very short liturgy, because it's not needed that people who remain will remember that person. Then the principal mourners, and then after other people, are invited to put earth on the coffin. The coffin is lowered in the presence of the mourners where possible. That's not been possible, interestingly, during COVID. That is, the coffin is lowered before, but principal mourners come forward to be followed by others, and it is considered to be to the merit of the deceased if the people present can fill in the grave. A very brief memorial prayer is chanted, and after that, mourner's Kaddish, which is a praise poem to God, is recited. It's interesting. The Kaddish has no mention of death at all. It only speaks about the promise of life and living, not after death, but in the world by those gathered around to the coffin. Burial is usually in a cemetery reserved for Jewish burial. And it is interesting that communities, the first purchase of Jewish communities in places outside of Israel where they had to settle were burial plots. So for example, in Philadelphia, where I grew up, the Mikveh Israel Cemetery was purchased before the congregation had a building, because that's the nature of life, isn't it? For the mourners, immediately after death, before the funeral, is considered to be a time called aninut, where the mourner is focused purely on the death and on preparing for the funeral. I mentioned that at the funeral, the mourner does say this prayer, and then that officially begins for people who are mourning parents, a year-long period of mourning.
Rabbi Lee, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to wrap up. So you can have some concluding remarks.
Okay, I should just say that the mourning period is to focus the individual on the death, but also to bring them into life and to bring them into community. Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi Lee. And I certainly remember you're helping me with my mom's funeral in that regard. Our next tradition, and the final tradition we'll be presenting on tonight, is Sikhism. And our speaker about Sikhism, Ms. Anu Bindra, was unable to attend, but she prepared a video. So I am going to, on her behalf, show that video for you. I forgot to make sure that you could hear it. So I'm going to do that in just a moment. And Ms. Bindra practices the Sikh way of life with her husband and her 2 sons. You see her now on the screen, and you'll be listening to her in a moment. And she's been participating in interfaith activities for over a decade. She's also a member of the board of directors of the Interfaith Institute of Long Island.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Anu Bindra, and I practice the Sikh way of life. And today I will be talking about the Antim Sanskar. Well, in Sikhism, death is considered a natural process, an absolute certainty that only happens when the Almighty commands and never otherwise, as a direct result of God's will or hukam. To a Sikh, birth and death are closely associated because they're both parts of the cycle of human life of coming and going, ana, jana, which is seen as the transient stage towards liberation, complete unity with God. Sikhs thus believe in reincarnation. However, by contrast, the soul itself is not subject to the cycle of birth and death is only the progression of the soul on its journey from God through the created universe and back to God again. In life, a Sikh tries always to constantly remember death so that he or she can be sufficiently prayerful, detached, and righteous to break the cycle of birth and death and return to God. Cremation is the preferred method of disposal, although if it is not possible, any other method such as burial or submergence at sea are acceptable. Worship of the dead with gravestones, etc. is discouraged. Because the body is considered only a shell, the person's soul is their true essence. The day of cremation. At the point of cremation, a few Shabads are sung from the Guru Granth Sahib, followed by Kirtan Sohila, the nighttime prayer, and finally the Ardas or the Antim Ardas, final prayer is offered. The eldest son or a close relative generally starts the process by pressing the button for the burning to begin. This service usually lasts between 30 to 60 minutes. The ashes are later collected and disposed by immersing them in the nearest river. Sikhs do not erect monuments over the remains of the dead. After the cremation ceremony, there is another service that is held at the Gurudwara, the Sikh place of worship, which is called the Sahaj Path Bhog ceremony. And this is optional. After the death of the Sikh, the family of the deceased may undertake non-continuous reading of the entire Guru Granth Sahib. This reading is timed to conclude within 10 days of the death of the person, and the reading may be undertaken at home or at the Gurdwara. The conclusion of this ceremony is called the Bhog ceremony, that marks the end of the mourning period. Generally, all relatives and friends of the family gather, and they sing the Slok Mela Nova, which is actually written by Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, our 9th Guru, and the Ram Kalisad, or the Call of God, is recited. After the final prayers, a random reading or the hukam is taken, the Kada Prasad is distributed, and Guru Ka Langar is served. As I mentioned before, that the Sikhs believe in reincarnation, there is something called the 84 lakh June, which is 8.4 million life forms or lifetimes that exist on planet Earth. They say after entering the 84 lakh June, there is no actual way to come out of it. It takes years and years to complete the cycle. And the final part of the cycle, one gets a chance to become a human and then release themselves from this world by chanting the name of God, which we call Vaheguru, repeatedly. The entire Guru Granth Sahib is actually explaining to us how we can obtain this moksha, liberation, through doing good deeds. Because once, your soul is released and submerges to God, you finish that cycle. If not, you go back in line and start the cycle again. So with this, I conclude my presentation. I thank you all for the time that you have, spent listening to my presentation. I loved every part of it. I learned so much from it myself, because making presentations is not easy. You have to go through a lot of books. But I thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I hope you all stay blessed. Thank you.
So at this point, I would just like to make a couple of comments and then invite our panelists to unmute and share observations and ask each other questions, and then we'll go to the attendees for comments and questions. One of the things that didn't come up tonight that I think is important for us to recognize is that each of the faith traditions, and of course the many more faiths that did not present tonight, have their own set of practices, rituals, prayers, that they engage in at this very important time of transition from life to death. And we are born into a tradition, and if we stay as practitioners of that tradition through our lives, we are raised with these practices unfolding around us. And I'm reminded of the time that my daughter, who is now an adult, came home from Hebrew school, and she was very sad and very upset. And I asked her what was going on, and she said that today in Hebrew school, they learned what Rabbi Lee mentioned is one of the prayers we recite at the time of a funeral. She learned the mourner's Kaddish, and she learned that as a Jew, it is her responsibility to say that only for her parents, her sibling, her spouse, or her child. And she was just very sad and upset to think about that event happening in her life with regard to her mother or to me. And I said to her, I know that this is hard for you at this time, but I want you to remember that when I pass, which will be, God willing, a long time from now, when you say this prayer, you will feel me hugging you, because this prayer will bring you comfort at a time of sadness. And the reason I share this is that in all of the traditions that we spoke about tonight, we learned about practices, some of which may be more or less familiar to us. And it's important to remember that while practices of another tradition may seem strange or hard to understand in some ways, they bring comfort to the community of mourners who share that tradition. And it is so much easier to go to weddings in different faith traditions because they're always joyous. Funerals can be harder, crossing faith lines, and that's why these conversations are so important for all of us. And now I invite all of the panelists to unmute themselves and ask one another questions or make comments and observations, and we'll do that for a few minutes, and then we'll take questions and comments from the attendees.
Can I say something, Ben?
Please.
Yes, I just wanted to tell you that this hugging, praying is so important. But I did mention in 10 minutes, it's like an express train. But I did mention everything that while at the time of death, we recite prayers, and that is to make comfort for the family and
Yes.
also for the departing soul.
Mm-hmm.
Then after death also, in the memorial service, funeral service, everywhere there are hymns, mantras and prayers. That is a constant part of it. And even in funeral service, the hugging and giving solace to family members, friends is one of the most important part of it, Yes.
Ben, if I could make a comment.
Please.
It was a very informative session. I learned quite a bit. But my comment relates to your engagement, your participation, and your initiative in making this possible. Without you, obviously, this would not have happened. And for that, we are very, very grateful. And I wanted also to mention, if you are the and from this team, Anubendra was the closer. She's the only one who participated in all 7 of the events, of all 4 events. And she represented the Sikh tradition. She is not here physically, but I plan to call her tomorrow and give her my appreciation. As far as we had a attendance today, and those who had signed up were not available, couldn't join us. We have these programs available on the Interfaith Institute website within 3 or 4 days. Hopefully, we'll load this as well as on the YouTube website. So we would love to have you and share it with your friends and colleagues who will, I'm sure, learn a lot from these tapes. And also just like the YouTube channel so that it gets more publicity and the word spreads around. So thank you, Ben, for all that you did. I think a YouTube a Zoom applause is in order for Ben and his participation in these programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Other panelists, comments or questions? And then I'll open up to attendees. Okay, so I'm going to, if you have a question, please put it in the chat and I'll call on you. But first I'm going to call on Reverend Dwight Walter, who has a question for all the panelists. Reverend Walter, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I can, and thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you to everyone. It's been very, very informative and enlightening. I'm curious about organ donation. If there's any, it's from all accounts, desperately shortage of this. I know 2 people during COVID who died waiting for organs. If there's any faith tradition, perhaps it would be easier if those who do not allow it, or whatever, however you wish to phrase that, frame that. Ben, thank you.
This is a response, please, from the presenters.
So it's interesting. I spoke that the body is supposed to be left in its natural state. But certainly there is a permit to take organs if they can be of use in almost any circumstance. This does the how much can be harvested depends on how traditional the particular denomination of Judaism is. But I know we have a very big drive in our congregation to have organ donors. I'm an organ donor. I'm signed up and the like, and so Judaism certainly favors that.
In the Islamic tradition, it's very clearly stated that if you can save a single life, it's like you have saved humanity. So if your donation helps someone restore their eyesight or restore their kidney function, it's certainly under those circumstances permitted, with of course appropriate permissions and so on. What unfortunately has happened in some parts, this has become now a business and people are selling organs. That is prohibited. That is not allowed. So organ donation, yes, and there are major transplantation centers in Muslim countries across the globe.
Do I jump in? I appreciate that because my 6-year-old daughter several years ago died in a car crash, and I had never thought of this. And of course, it's a very timely matter. So before I could even let her sibling know that she had died, he was 10, she was 6, I donated her organs. So it's very close to home, but consequently, I've have a vested interest in it and done a lot of research. Thank you very much.
And Reverend Walter, as tragic as that was, and I'm so sorry for your daughter and for, what that has meant to your family. But it is also my understanding that that a child's organs can be used to save the lives of children, and so it is my hope that your daughter saved many lives. We have a question. We have a comment from Dr. Juthani or a question?
Yes.
Yeah, my quick answer to this organ donation also includes the body donation. And since from Jainism perspective, the body has lost already the Atma, which has moved on, the soul has moved on. If this body can be used for any purpose, it is good. And but the times when this was in many old years ago, there was nothing about donations. So we don't find this particularly in the scriptures.
Thank you, Dr. Juthani. Dr. Shah, do you have?
Yes. I want to say a couple of things. That yes, the whole body can be donated to a medical college for the dissection purpose also. But this is, I thought that this is not the part of our subject, because donation of organ donation or the whole body donation has to be discussed during the life when person is really up to it to decide, and it is already decided, it is given the permission, and the doctors will do it before releasing the body. So this is beyond, I think it was more of a medical question than, and it is beyond the what you call limit of our subject today, but it is very important that everybody should understand that how much they can do. Now, so many organs can be donated, and including the whole body to the medical college for this action. So thank you very much.
I just want to remind everyone of a bumper sticker that's been around, which is, don't take your organs to heaven. Heaven knows we need them here. So moving on to another question, I see a hand up from Ashok Karnik. I'm going to ask you, okay, so you've unmuted yourself. Can you share your question?
Yeah, I just a couple of comments. Thank you very much for this series. It was very, very informative, very useful. Second comment is that I have had the privilege and the pleasure to work with Dr. Khan in the same hospital, and we have really shared many cases together and treated many cases together. And one of the things that I always remember and teach my younger colleagues is that a good physician knows the difference between prolonging the act of dying and postponing death. And I think that is something that we as caregivers need to remember always. And a lot of times the patients look up to us to really advise them what should be done, because they really don't have answers to these questions. They don't know what the prognosis of the patient is there. And it is our duty to really explain everything and let them make the decision as per patient's own wishes. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Bob Keeler had a question in the chat.
Sure. You know, up until recently, as I understand it, the Catholic Church taught that cremation was a bad idea. Church has come around now saying that's fine, but don't scatter the ashes, as I understand it, is still the admonition. I don't know, Monsignor Beckman may correct me on that, but I don't understand what the rationale is, given that we all, those of us who believe in life after death, believe that the Creator can resurrect us from whatever state we happen to be in and wherever we happen to be buried or not buried. So that was my question. I don't know if anybody has any answer to that.
Well, first of all, Bob, the reason for the change in the attitude toward cremation is, as I had mentioned in my presentation, we believe very much in the resurrection of the body, that we don't know exactly what that means, but somehow at the end of the world, there will be a new heavens and a new earth, and we will be raised to have the body the way Jesus is raised, which is not exactly the same as our body now. So cremation in the past was understood as a denial of that, as an attempt to say, no, there will be no resurrection, and we'll make sure there will be a resurrection because we'll cremate the body. That obviously is not the case. Cremation is something much richer than that. That's the reason that attitude within the Catholic Church and other Christian churches changed. But as to the second part of your question, yes, we do have a sense of the importance of burial. Again, that's part of the connection with the way in which, after his death, Jesus was buried and then rose from the dead. Beyond that, I would probably, Bob, be just as mystified as you. I'm not entirely sure why there seems to be such a strong prohibition against the scattering of ashes. Of course, there are all sorts of secular legal prohibitions of that these days also that we need to take into consideration.
Thank you, Monsignor Beckman. There is a question from Reverend Eastland in the chat. Reverend Eastland, would you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure, thank you so much. We have a lot of interfaith couples on our multi-faith campus in Brookville, and a question has come up over and over again about how interfaith couples can go about being buried in the same cemetery if they're of a different faith. And I have not known how to approach that or help them. So any assistance that any of the presenters have tonight would be very helpful.
My wife and I actually discussed this before we were married. And so, as I've mentioned, for those who don't know me, in the course of this evening, I am Jewish. My wife was raised Catholic and identifies as Christian. We agreed, because we talked about everything before we decided to get married. We agreed that we would be buried in a secular cemetery, with each of us having the rites of our tradition. Although I've come to think that it would be in some ways easier if each of us would be buried in the rites of the other's tradition, in terms of comforting the mourner. But we haven't discussed doing quite that. Do others have suggestions?
I think your suggestion of being buried in a non-denominational place is a good suggestion. There are cemeteries, there are non-denominational cemeteries with different sections that permit people to be buried next to one another, couples to be buried next to one another.
If I might just pick up, Ben, and this, Vicky, is not a direct answer to your question, but more going back to, Ben, what you said about discussing everything before being married. I just think that is such an essential thing. And my experience has been that many couples don't do that. They're afraid that they can't, or they're afraid they're not going to find the solutions. And yet for the sake of the strength of their relationship, I think it's so important that they have those understandings ahead of time.
Thank you,
Can I?
Dr. Shah. Mhm.
Yes, I just wanted to say about the cremation that there is, I don't think it is because of any kind of attitude or against the burial, but we believe that this body is made of 5 elements. And when you cremate, I think we go back to that 5 elements, and whatever the remains that we put it into the auspicious water of Ganges, just so that it is a flowing water. And according to them, it is, it just gets dissolved and goes back to the 5 elements. It has nothing about pollution, because it is a very little remnants that remain. This is how I understand. It has nothing to do with any kind of attitude towards burial. And there are some Hindus who does the burial too, but majority will go for cremation. Yes.
Mhm. Thank you. I see a question from Simi.
Hi, Ben.
Hi.
Thank you so much. This was a very enlightening program. I really enjoyed it. I had a question for Rabbi Friedlander and also Monsignor Beckman. I was wondering if in the Jewish and Christian traditions, is it allowed to share your burial space with us, for example? We are having a lot of problems getting grave plots these days. The Muslims.
I have to say that burial practices are very, very much determined by the cemeteries. For example, I know we have one of our congregants recently died and wanted the ashes of her spouse buried with her, and it was not permitted by the cemetery. It was fine with us, but it was not. Many times, I shouldn't say many times, it's all up to the cemetery and the rules of the particular cemetery, what can happen.
I cannot speak for every Christian tradition in that, because I just don't know. But just speaking from my own Catholic tradition, spouses may always be buried together, even if they are of different religious traditions. That we would certainly recognize the sanctity of marriage in that way.
I am going to take my privilege as the host tonight to share a concluding comment and then wrap things up with some additional information. So we've been spending a lot of time, of course, this evening it was the topic, talking about death, dying, and funerals. And I want to turn our attention to the way that many of our speakers tonight have framed these topics in the context of life. And I would like to share with you that personally, a couple of years ago, I, with absolutely no state of depression or thoughts of suicide whatsoever, decided to write my own obituary. And the reason I did that was because I wanted to make sure that I am living my life in accordance with how I wish to be remembered. And I look at it every few months because, you know, I spend a lot of time in my professional role as a professor of Russian. And I'm teaching about Russian literature, and I'm organizing classes, and I'm doing research, and I'm going to conferences. But I want to be remembered first and foremost as a husband, a father, a son, and a brother, and an uncle, and God willing, someday a grandfather. So what does that mean in terms of the decisions I make day to day? And I would like to ask for all of us who are watching this live tonight, participating, and those who may see it later in the on the YouTube channel or at the Interfaith Institute's website, to not take to your bed in a depressive state, thinking about all of these things, but rather think about how to have a meaningful and fulfilling life that aligns with your values, your goals, your aspirations, and what is dearest to your heart. And that being said, I'd like to ask all of us to give a Zoom round of applause to all of our wonderful panelists tonight. It's been just fascinating. In addition, I thank all of you for coming tonight and perhaps to some of the previous sessions to explore the spiritual paths of the diverse people who live here on Long Island and around the world. While this was the final event in our series exploring life cycle rituals, I assure you that the Interfaith Institute of Long Island remains actively engaged in bringing to the public opportunities to thoughtfully explore the diverse faiths of the world, many of which I'm very proud to say are represented by people living right here on Long Island among us. They are our neighbors. By virtue of having registered for tonight's event, I believe you will be receiving news of other events sponsored by the Interfaith Institute of Long Island. To learn more about the Interfaith Institute of Long Island, I encourage you to visit this website, and I hope that you can see it. And also to make clear what that URL was. Whoops, sorry. I'm going to put the URL up in big letters for you. Here it is. So that you can see that. Please join us for future events, which I'm sure will be interesting and valuable. With that, on behalf of Hofstra University and the Interfaith Institute of Long Island, I wish you all good health and happiness now and always. And thank you for attending tonight, and good night. And now I will stop the recording.